Hello, class. Good afternoon. It is Wednesday afternoon, and I wanted to take this time for our quick lecture and for me to highlight a few elements of our class. And firstly, please, when you have a chance, go over to Moodle. All the stuff that we've covered so far is placed on Moodle. All the links and lectures are posted there with all the YouTube links and all the class lectures. I just wanted to mention briefly that please remember your reflection assignment is coming up due on August the 9th, and you should all at this point have already taken your midterm. The other thing you need to think about is your quiz 2. Make sure if you haven't that you have completed that. Take some time to go over the PowerPoints on the judiciary and my overview on that, in addition to the lecture on the judiciary. I also posted some of the thoughts of a long-time senator from Alabama, Lindsey Graham, about the Supreme Court confirmation process and how that process has been severely politicized. But for this week, we are thinking about the economy and economic policy. And I'm going to highlight a couple of the items on our week 6 class. That's the PowerPoint on economic policy and the Word document summarizing the economy. And just for starters, I want to go over the PowerPoint on the economy in terms of basic concepts related to the economy. So very important to understand that government is a relation of organizations of individuals, a particular set of institutions and people. Government is authorized by formal documents. It's legally empowered. So, for example, in the context of the US, our federal government, our states' governments are empowered or authorized by our US Constitution. Our states are authorized. They are highlighted and given personhood by virtue of the 10th Amendment of our Constitution, which gives states reserved powers. Our federal government's powers are in the Constitution also, those of the executive in Article 2, the legislative arm of government in Article 1, and the judicial arm of government in Article 3. And government makes binding decisions on behalf of a community. So our US government makes decisions on behalf of the United States, not only for domestic affairs, but also for affairs or issues around foreign policy. The other thing I need to differentiate here is the difference between government and politics. So government has to do with those organizations, individuals, and institutions that cater to the needs of a particular people, whereas politics has to do with that process of government. In other words, that give and take, that compromise about how, when, and how goods, services, assets, resources are to be distributed or redistributed within our society. So, for example, if you think about Obamacare or universal health care, the politics of universal health care is that give and take about what percentage of federal funds will go to the states, what percentage of funding will remain with the federal government, what will the role of the federal government be, what will the role of states be, what will the role of local jurisdictions, what will that be. But government specifically has to deal with the institutions. Politics has to deal with the process of government. Good governance speaks to the rule of law, property rights, regulatory regime, whether you're thinking, for example, monetary regulatory regime, fiscal regulatory regime. Monetary regulatory regime, we're thinking about money supply in the economy. Fiscal regulatory regime, we're thinking about things like interest rates, how those rates are regulated either to stimulate the economy, to make it grow faster, or to reduce the speed of the economy by reducing the pace at which the economy is growing. Government's power, the ability to get people or groups to do what they otherwise would not do, the coercive power of government. Government's power helps to develop institutions to carry out policies. Sometimes these policies are unpopular, and sometimes they are popular. Political institutions, we're thinking organizations, individuals, agencies. We're thinking electoral rules in relation, for instance, to districting. Also constitutional rules. Political institutions constrain arbitrary exercise of power by politicians or bureaucrats. In other words, they limit what politicians or bureaucrats can do. Economic policy outcomes in relation to inflation, the level of inflation, right? The volume of money in relation to goods and services provided within the economy, budget deficits. We're thinking that difference between how much the government takes in and how much it actually spends. Tariffs, we're thinking about the taxes on imports from other countries. Economic policy outcomes, we're thinking about how political institutions play an important role in terms of economic policy outcomes, how they resolve redistribution and conflict from economic policy. For example, in 2021, what will the tax rate be? Taxes are a form of redistribution. So you take from those that have more or made more, and you redistribute to those that have less. Taxes can be progressive or regressive. Progressive taxes basically mean that you pay relative to your income, you pay a larger amount. Regressive income taxes are basically based on those having more keeping more, and those who have less getting less. 3 examples of economic policy: budget deficits, financial market policy, trade policy. So budget deficits, for example, the federal government in the United States, a budget deficit would be that the government spending a lot more than it's bringing in. In terms of financial markets, you're thinking about commodity exchanges. For example, the commodity exchange for metals, for produce in Chicago. Your financial markets, like the New York Stock Exchange and the indices, the Dow Jones, the NASDAQ. And also thinking about your trade policy, right? So thinking about international agreements that we have and how those shape economic policy. For example, NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which has been reconstituted by Trump. We have individual trade agreements between the United States, the European Union, between the United States and different countries around the world. So again, budget deficits, that difference between revenue and expenditure. Take a look at some of the details in terms of the budgets, in terms of financial regulations, international trade policy. This is very important when you're thinking about how different industries in the United States suffer or benefit from our international trade policy. So, for example, if Ford relocates a manufacturing plant from Detroit to South Korea or to the Philippines, there is a net loss for the country because those jobs that would have been provided for in Detroit now move to another country as that company tries to reduce its overhead. Conversely, if Mercedes sets up a manufacturing plant in Mississippi, that's a net benefit to the state of Mississippi, thinking very broadly in terms of the fact that Mississippi would get to benefit from that investment. So take a look at the causes of corruption and some of the challenges of corruption, institutions of the government, taxation policy and institutions, and also thinking about some of the concluding elements. Political institutions matter. Good governance is essential for good financial and economic development. And you need an effective state in order to have effective economic policy. Very broadly, in terms of the economy, you'll notice on your Word document, each icon has a link. So please take a look at some of those links. I provided a link on the economy icon or economy title to the Federal Reserve. Take a look at some of the issues that the Federal Reserve is dealing with at this point. Under fiscal policy, I provided a link around stable fiscal policy in terms of your interest rates, your broad macro fiscal planning. How does the government deal with interest rates, for example? So in times of economic slowdown, you want to cut interest rates to stimulate borrowing and stimulate money to get into the economic system. In terms of periods when you have extremely high economic growth, in anticipation for economic slowdown or overheating of the economy or recession, governments might want to raise interest rates to reduce the growth and overheating of the economy, the pace at which the economy is growing. Raising interest rates discourages borrowing because the cost of credit is higher. Cutting interest rates tends to increase borrowing because the cost of credit, the cost of borrowing, each dollar is less because you pay less in interest. So those are some of the tricks that the government can use to provide fiscal policy growth or slowdown in the economy. Monetary policy basically has to deal with your money supply. Econometrics, this idea of how you use algorithms to determine how much money you need within the economy so that you don't have too much money chasing too few goods, which will essentially lead to inflation and inflationary economy. Also thinking about tax cuts, right? So why are tax cuts important? Tax cuts tend to incentivize growth because entrepreneurs, creators of value, business owners will be encouraged to borrow more to expand their business. Tax cuts also benefit businesses because it reduces their overhead and allows them to keep more of their profit, which is anticipated will lead to them investing more into the economy and growing the economy more. However, tax cuts can in and of themselves create serious political resentment, particularly when it's perceived that the middle class of a certain economy, in the case of the US economy, is paying more of its share of the tax burden relative to its income. So if you're making $50,000 a year and you're paying 30% of your income in taxes, and someone else is making $1 million a year and paying 30% on taxes, as a person making $30,000 a year, you're actually paying more relative to your income. It's the same rate, but because your income's smaller, the amount of your disposable income that you're paying in taxes is actually higher. So take a look at that. I've provided some links in terms of Keynesian economics, in terms of tax deficits and tax cuts. I've also provided a clip there on Trump's trade war with China and some food for thought in terms of critical thinking questions. Some of the economic resources are provided there, some of the institutions you should be looking to. Feel free to send me an email if you have any questions, and have a good